You know, as a Christian, I've always been infatuated with the story about the Pilgrims. I mean, they were called separatists. They left England because of persecution. They simply didn't want to be forced to have to be part of the Anglican church service with a certain clergy and having to read certain prayers. They wanted to have home meetings. They wanted to worship. It's a lot of the American spirit we have today as to how we want to worship God. So when I heard the story about the founding with the Pilgrims, I had to go back and relook at it, because these were men and women that were actually fleeing persecution in order to find a place where they could worship God. And that's actually true. It's just not the whole truth, because they didn't come alone as pilgrims seeking the land. On the Mayflower, that one small ship had 102 souls in it, but fewer than half of them were actually Christians. They called themselves the saints. And the rest of them, well, they were merchants and craftsmen and hired men, fortune seekers. They were chasing an opportunity and to get a return on somebody else's investment. They were entrepreneurs. Now, the saints had a name for these people. They called them the strangers. Faith on one side of the deck and fortune and entrepreneurs on the other. It was covenant and commerce, both mingled together on the same boat, and they didn't necessarily get along that well. But here's what they don't teach you in school. When that ship finally made land, they were blown off course. They ended up north of where they were authorized to go. So they had to wait to get a patent to be able to set up houses and occupy some land that was north of the target. And what happened then was that the strangers and the saints had a meeting, and the strangers said, look, whatever contract we had on that other territory, it's broken right now. When we get off this boat, it's every man for himself. The problem was it was winter, and they started talking about it, and the saints realized they need to reason with the strangers. They said, look, this whole experiment is going to fall apart. If we don't stand together, how are we going to survive, especially in a winter? So they wrote something down. They agreed they needed some kind of a contract with each other. And so 41 men signed the contract. It's called the Mayflower Compact. And it's kind of interesting because it's an early version of how this diversity of people seeking God and freedom can work together with a secular colony. It was an agreement that would keep the saints and the strangers on the same boat. And I'm quoting, they want just and equal laws for all of us. And that tension between those two groups really never left us. Faith and pursuit of wealth. The sacred and the self-made entrepreneur. The people who came there to build an altar and claim the land for Jesus, and the people who came there to claim the land for an empire and wealth. We've always been two peoples trying to be one nation, and somehow that adventure and DNA and piety all had to work together. This week, I want to talk you through what happens when those two forces collide, because if you think America has never been divided like we are right now, well, you'll never have the encouragement that comes from actually knowing your history. To know that we got on that boat with a whole lot of tension, and we came off the boat, in a sense, with different aspirations. But the American experiment is held together, I believe, because the spiritual fiber of that pilgrim community, the original believers, fortified by great awakenings over time, enabled the country to be permeated with a kind of a moral strength and a vision of transcendent values, that God is over us, and then we have to work out a way that we can coexist. That's where we are in our 250th. And we've got to navigate this thing, because there's a political organization right now of secular and atheistic influences that sees Christianity and, frankly, the Republican Party as something that has to be pulled out because it's dangerous. We've been here before in different ways. I want to show you the history of America in our 250th year. It'll give you insight prophetically into the patterns of who we are as a people and where we're going next. Hey, friends, I'm working on a project at home late at night. You know, I can always tell when God's in it because I get energy doing it. This 29-day devotional that I'm putting together is for you. You and I can cover every single day from July 4th to 29 days later, the amount of time it took for them to get all the signatures on that Declaration of Independence. And every single page that I've got in there is an insight on what the guys wrote and why they wrote it and how it applies today. I also have a coin, a special commemorative coin for the 250th. And this coin is to remind you and me that we stood together during this pivotal year, the year when history had a hinge. We were there. It's going to remind you to pray, remind you to be in the Great Awakening, and remind you that you are connected to a whole bunch of us that are standing at history's moment to see America go into a Great Awakening. Get the 29-day devotional and get that commemorative coin. Go to lancewallnau.com/America and join me on this very anointed discovery journey. It's worth knowing this story. When those pilgrims came, they were desperate about having freedom. They were persecuted, locked up in Britain. They tried to go to Holland. It didn't work. They came to the United States. And there were two ships that left together. There was one called the Speedwell that was accompanying the Mayflower. Far safer to have two ships. What if one starts to sink? Which there was always the danger of that because of storms or damage. The Speedwell, however, started the journey along the Mayflower and took on water. They had to go back. They went out again. It took on water again. Now the Christians are praying on that Mayflower, dear Lord, we're not even going to have the other ship. They had to take off on their own. So in 1620, they went off and prayed that their ship wasn't going to be leaking. Now, passengers sometimes fell overboard. Ships could be taken over by pirates, and the people could end up being slaved by other countries. It was all very real risks. It wasn't nearly like cruising like we have today. But halfway to America, they hit a bad storm, and they virtually almost lost the ship. But someone had the foresight to bring with them a thing called a great iron screw. And the main beam that held the ship together was broken, but that screw came out and they were able to fasten it and keep it upright. And so they made their journey. As it was, only one person actually died on the journey over. But when they had landed, the circumstances were so severe, the first winter was so difficult, that if I'm not mistaken, nearly half of the people that made that journey died. And that, yet nevertheless, was the price they paid. And they wanted to pay that price, knowing what it was, because freedom and being able to worship God meant that much to them. And so that Mayflower made it. It's not exactly the Thanksgiving picture that we all celebrate, but it gives you an idea of the more gritty reality of something new coming along and the endurance would be required. Let me read to you what that compact actually looked like. They wrote, having undertaken for the glory of God and the advancement of the Christian faith, in honor of our king and country, a voyage to plant the first colony in the northern parts of Virginia, do by these presents solemnly and mutually in the presence of God and of one another covenant, and combine ourselves together in a civil body politic for our better ordering and the preservation and furtherance of the ends aforesaid. And by virtue hereof to enact, constitute, and frame just such an equal laws, ordinances, acts, and constitutions and offices from time to time, as should be thought most meet and convenient for the general good of the colony, unto which we promise all due submission and obedience, in witness whereof we have hereunder subscribed our names at Cape Cod on the 11th of November, 1620. It's curious to me that the compact clearly is headed up by a pursuit of the glory of God and the advancement of the Christian faith. It gives you a sense of the mission, Great Commission yearning that was inside these people who were starting afresh. William Bradford, William Brewster, Miles Standish, some names that kind of like, you sort of know who they are. You've heard them before. But they were a hardy group and an interesting group. And I just want to say that was characteristic of the soil that goes into that American DNA. Now, the country emerges. I want to talk about the stressors, the conflicts that have in our history, because as I said, as I looked at this, I was surprised to see how many convulsions we've gone through to get where we are today. Certainly you have the war itself. And what is frequently not talked about is the number of times in which God himself sovereignly, or the word they use is providentially, in nature, would protect the colonists from almost imminent destruction. They came so close to not making it that it's only a real understanding of that history. For instance, when Washington first was trying to take on the British up in Long Island, he had gotten himself into a situation where he was trapped, like on Brooklyn Heights. He was trapped in such a way that the British could easily have taken his little fort and captured him and all the beginning of the Continental Army. But an immense fog came in by Providence. And even though the Brits were only like 600 yards away in observation, the fog was so intense that Washington said they put cloth around the wheels of their cannons, and they overnight he had his men moving around, lighting fires and making noise like they're digging, and in order to make the illusion that they were really settling in for the siege, while his army was actually evacuating, and evacuated in every boat and ship. It's almost like Dunkirk that they could find to get his army over. Washington was the last man to leave, and when the fog lifted the next day, the British were shocked at two things. One was, how in the world did they create such fortifications in the first place? And secondly, where are they? They were gone. And so Washington was referred to as the Gray Fox because his basic strategy was trying not to engage because he knew he couldn't beat them, so he just had to frustrate them by evading them. For years, he had to figure out how to escape them. And this gave him a reputation of not being a warrior and a fighter, but in fact, he was losing battles when he had to fight. He was in a better position just trying to outlast the British and exasperate them and exhaust them into giving up. But I want to share with you a couple of thoughts here that I think are pretty important about the early days themselves. When the British had finally been defeated at Yorktown, it happened because of the French got involved. The French, Franklin had some influence over them, had some diplomatic influence, and he got them to support financially and support with their military, their ships, a blockade, so that at Yorktown, Cornwallis couldn't escape. And they had a sufficient concentration of guns that came in from the north in Canada, and that came down kind of heroically by Henry Knox, bringing them in the winter over miles and miles of terrain. He got Washington guns from, I believe it was Fort Ticonderoga. And when they had that set up, that artillery barrage was what brought down the British, who by all means probably could have won the war had it not been for France stepping in and certainly blockading the military so that the ships weren't able to support Cornwallis. They had to surrender. And I don't know that we can fully appreciate the fact that the British Army is going to go on to defeat Napoleon. But this militia that was cobbled together by Washington and held together by his own tenacity was able to eventually win that war. It's a kind of amazing story about how we even succeeded in coming out as a nation. Let me read to you the notes that I have on the fog at the Battle of Long Island, which was in August of 1776. Washington Army was pinned against the East River, the British closing in. Overnight, an unnatural fog settled over the water. 9,000 men slipped across to Manhattan in rowboats undetected, and Washington was the last man off the beach. That strikes me as being an act of God that many people missed. I think it was Franklin that said we've seen so many incidents of providence in the war, referring to God's intervention. This is what they're talking about. At Valley Forge in the winter of 1777, we were so close to collapsing. It wasn't a battle, it was an endurance test. Roughly 2,000 men died of cold, hunger, and disease. Washington wrote that the army would starve and dissolve or disperse, but it didn't. It was the drill of a German that came over named von Steuben that it instilled a certain sense of European elan and structure and esprit de corps amongst this ragtag army. They had chaplains. They had a commander who refused to leave, and he turned a dying army into a professional one. And that lowest point became a turning point when Washington took off across the Delaware. Most people don't realize this. He had 3 flanks that were going to cross over. 2 of them couldn't make it across in the ice. Only he could. He planned on arriving in the dark, but he arrived at daylight. Then they had to march 9 miles in the snow. Many of his Continental soldiers there did not even have shoes. You could see blood in the snow. But they surprised the Hessians, and they were able to overtake them. England had hired 30,000 Hessians to be dispersed among the colonies to go fight the Americans. But they took Trenton, and then Washington went on to surprise the British again in Princeton. And it was these 2 symbolic victories that were like the psychic oxygen that kept the spark of hope alive when we were virtually ready to disband our army and give up. How close America's come to collapse is amazing. And although I'm leaping ahead, I want to share with you one other incident that is another one of those strange moments. America is going to go to war with Britain, whether you realize it or not, again. The peace that we had didn't hold. And so around 1812 to 1814, we're back in conflict with Britain. Britain and France have been at war. And we're at war with Britain because what the English did was they cut off our trade because they didn't want any support going to France. And in cutting off our trade, they were driving America into a depression. Worse yet, when American ships were found trying to do business, they would take the ship over and they would basically kidnap all the Americans and re-enlist them as English sailors who would fight the French. And so there were hundreds and perhaps thousands of merchants who ended up getting kidnapped by the Brits, and this produced eventually armed conflict again between the U.S. and England. We'll be right back. Hey friends, I'm working on a project at home late at night. You know, I can always tell when God's in it because I get energy doing it. This 29-day devotional that I'm putting together is for you. You and I can cover every single day from July 4th to 29 days later, the amount of time it took for them to get all the signatures on that Declaration of Independence. And every single page that I've got in there is an insight on what the guys wrote and why they wrote it and how it applies today. I also have a coin, a special commemorative coin for the 250th. And this coin is to remind you and me that we stood together during this pivotal year, the year when history had a hinge. We were there. It's going to remind you to pray, remind you to be in the Great Awakening, and remind you that you are connected to a whole bunch of us that are standing at history's moment to see America go into a Great Awakening. Get the 29-day devotional and get that commemorative coin. Go to lancewallnau.com/America and join me on this very anointed discovery journey. So the incident I want to talk about, which is another act of providence, was in August of 1814. The British actually went to Washington. They occupied our capital, and they burnt down the White House, and they burnt down our capital. As a matter of fact, Dolly Madison, in a kind of a famous moment, she raced in to get Washington's portrait and pulled it out of the flames so that it could be preserved. But that night, God did something interesting, a freak storm that hasn't been repeated in Washington since then. By some accounts, it was a storm and a tornado that suddenly broke into the District of Columbia, the city, and slammed the house, slammed the burning buildings, doused all the fires by a deluge of rain, and then targeted the British so that the British saw it as an omen, and they actually escaped out of Washington. It was as though nature itself was conspiring against them. And its lowest ebb in 1776, America's lowest ebb, it recovered in months. And in 1814, once again, it was God that in a sense had the last say as to who's going to occupy soil in the United States. Those acts of providence, I'm afraid, they sometimes get lost. So, all right, so we have the struggling new republic. We win the war. We settle for. We try to create a peace, and John Jay negotiates some kind of a negotiation to put an end to the conflict. And a lot of Americans weren't happy with his terms, but America was in a place where it wasn't strong enough to be involved with a war with France or with Britain. So Washington was wisely trying to say, we're not there yet. This nation is too young. We can't go there. But we had a way of having at least a way out of it. But I want to talk about the struggle we had getting our country together, because it wasn't that after the war, everybody celebrated and we were a United States of America. It didn't work that way. The first test that I want to bring up is a thing called Shays' Rebellion. Shays' Rebellion is one of the most important events in early American history because it convinced many of the leaders of the country that what we had with this loose fellowship of states wasn't going to cut it. We wouldn't survive as 13 colonies all being friends. That was originally what the Articles of Confederation were trying to do. How to have, everybody can have, Virginia can do what it wants to do, Georgia can do what it wants to do. You guys have your own, trade, your own policies, currencies. We don't need to have a national army now. We defeated the enemy. And what happened was they discovered that if you don't have a strong centralized government, if you don't work closer together as one nation, then you could get broken up piecemeal by not having the centralized unity to be able to maintain the diversity and all the competing interests that take place. So here's a quick insight as to what happens here. I'll bounce around a little bit because there's some things that happened before this I want to go back to. But Shays' Rebellion is kind of interesting because it was the farmers who were in Massachusetts. Many of them served in the Continental Army. They returned home, and there was always a problem with these guys getting paid. They had worked for 8, 9 years, and they were promised to get paid, and they weren't paid. Worse yet, when they go home, they return home with little or no pay. But the United States, even so, whatever form of government we had was in debt to France. We owed money. We had incurred debt. We were trying to be a trading status, so we couldn't be insolvent. We couldn't look like people that were bankrupt. So there was this stress to how do you pay the army, but how do you also honor your debts? Because we have to have trade, so we have an economy that we could build so that we actually can afford to pay people, what we owe them. So when the farmers got back, they couldn't. They had taxes to pay off the war debts, but they were angry, as you can imagine. They had served, they hadn't been properly paid. Now they're getting taxed in Massachusetts, and if they couldn't pay it, well, then the banks would seize their properties, or they would put them in debtors' prisons. They foreclosed on their farms. The farmers believed that they had fought for liberty. They didn't plan on losing their farms and their livelihoods when they got home. They were ripe for a rebellion. And so you have this thing called Shays' Rebellion. Daniel Shay was one of the Continental Army captains, and he organized the protest. And basically what they wanted was, hey, we want relief from these debts. You can't tax us at this rate. We can't afford it. Stop foreclosing on our farms and stop putting us in prison. And so what they did was they figured if these courts are going to continue to release these orders, we will shut them down. So they were soldiers, man. They remembered how to fight. They were from the Continental Army. So they suited up again, grabbed their weapons, and they physically shut down courts so that judges weren't able to operate, and that ended their foreclosures. Well, that was one solution. But obviously, once you've got groups of armed farmers gathering and preventing court proceedings, and they're destabilizing the states, the federal government, as young as it was, Washington said, this is not good. Matter of fact, he said, as he referred to it, he said, this is like a snowball. This thing grows. Everything we tried to do, we're going to have a problem. It's going to be there. It's going to be in New England. It's going to be we have to have a stronger federal government. And that was what the catalyst was that made them go do the Constitution. They weren't naturally going to do it. They wanted everybody to kind of coexist. I wonder what would have happened if Shays' Rebellion didn't happen, because they had so many divisions and separate interests that the Articles of Confederation was enough of a compromise to get them all at least stay connected as 13 friends. But it wouldn't work. Without a centralized authority, this experiment would not hold together. So in 1787, the rebels decided that they were going to have to go further, and they went to go seize a cache of weapons, just like the British were going to do at Lexington and Concord. This is what the farmers did. They wanted to go to where the arsenals were and get the weapons so that they could not be used against them. And so there was a Springfield armory there, and there was a state militia, because there was state militaries, not a central military. There was a former general of the Continental Army in 1787, whose name was Benjamin Lincoln. And he was so concerned about this uprising that he raised 3,000 militia to go help that garrison when it was under attack. So the garrison leader had got cannons and shot grape shot, which is almost like shotgun shells, like pellets that went out, killed like 4 of Shays' soldiers, and they backed up. They decided this wasn't worth pursuing. They had like 20 that were wounded, 4 killed. And then Benjamin Lincoln was arriving at that time from the eastern part of the state, and he led his men on a night march through a snowstorm. And they surprised that rebel camp. They captured a lot of those rebels. Many fled. Shay escaped himself over the border into New Hampshire and Vermont. And in 1788, as an interesting gesture from Washington, he was pardoned and said, look, this is not the way our government's going to resolve problems. But they didn't hang him. They didn't kill him. They pardoned him. And Shays' Rebellion left a whole lot of people saying, this system of government we got is fragile. We're going to need a little more centralized authority. And so the founders saw the evidence that they needed to have a constitution. Just wanted to let you know what formed the Constitution. A lot of people think Declaration of Independence was done one day, and we had a new form of government a week later. It wasn't. It was like years later, driven by necessity, because the states really were not comfortable with that. But the farmers had an interesting argument. They were standing up against what they felt was the wealthy class that was punishing working people. And so you see the seeds even today of the potential unrest that happens when the working class feels as though they are being abused by people that are elites with privilege and power. That dynamic is not necessarily outside of our soil. It's in our very history. So if the American Revolution asked, do we have the power to break away from Britain? The answer was yes, we do. But Shays' Rebellion said, can America survive after throwing off Britain if it isn't a centralized, unified government with its own constitution and military and banking? And we're going to have to get a little more sophisticated, guys, or this experiment's going to fall apart. So the Constitution that came together in 1787 was, to a great extent, the founders' answer to the question of what do we do to make sure we don't have any more Shay rebellions. It's kind of an interesting piece of history there. Washington, the quote I wanted to give you earlier is Washington wrote nervously. He said, commotions of this sort, they're like snowballs. They gather strength as they roll. So they all had this burden. What's interesting about Washington is that the poor guy, I developed a sense of empathy for him. After the years of toil in leading the Revolutionary War effort, he really wanted to go back and enjoy some celebrity status and buy land and be a landowner and an aristocracy in the new nation and just be able to retire and do what he wants to do. And he couldn't, because he was so indispensable. When they put this Constitution together, they said, George, you've got to preside over us. No one else has the brand stature and credibility for all 13 colonies, because the Southern still didn't trust the Northern, and there was all kinds of divisions in there. We all trust you. And Washington reluctantly said, I'll preside. Well, he presided, and they made him the presiding president. And the poor guy, he actually hated the job. He's true to fact, he didn't want the job. He had to do it because he's the only one who could do it. You know, you could hear me. I'm exploring our history as I want you to explore it, because I think that hidden in our past are the fault lines and the insights into who we are as a people and how we got where we are, because the patterns repeat themselves in different ways throughout our history, and it brings us to the place we're at now.
250 years ago, 56 men risked everything to declare a truth that still shakes the world. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that every human being is created by God, endowed with unalienable rights. They pledged their lives, their fortunes, their sacred honor. Many paid in full. For 29 days, Lance Wallnau walks you through every phrase, anchored in Scripture, applied to your generation. This is not a study about rebellion. It's a study about stewardship. Will you be found faithful with the inheritance you've been given? Honor America's Christian Foundation. Get your devotional and commemorative coin at lancewallnau.com/America today.
Did you enjoy this latest episode? Please remember to share it with your friends, because the more knowledge you have, the better equipped you are to navigate the world.